Keir Starmer's government has exposed itself for what it is. This is supposed to be the Labour Party, a Labour government. Let's just quickly go through who their big targets have been so far. They've gone for pensioners by attacking the winter fuel payment. They've gone for children by voting to keep the Tories' two-child benefit cap, which drives so many kids into poverty, many of them in working households as it happens. And now they're going for disabled people. So we have a government which robs pensioners, robs children, and which is now determined to rob disabled people and those with serious health conditions. It's like they're going through a list of society's most vulnerable people and thinking, how can we make their lives that little bit harder? What's next? Let's hope they don't start leafing through the Old Testament and settle on, I don't know, killing the firstborn. Best not to give them ideas. Now, to be fair, it's not just Britain's most vulnerable people they've got in their sights. They've gutted foreign aid so they can spend more money on weapons. So that means less aid for, say, Ukrainian refugees or the Palestinians in Gaza who they've helped Israel slaughter, not least by continuing to give them crucial parts for F-35 jets to rain death and destruction on children, the elderly, innocent civilians. So what have the dead behind the eyes, soulless hacks who run the Labour Party got in store for disabled people as they plunge the party into crisis by repelling anyone who's slightly to the left of Genghis Khan? For the avoidance of doubt, I'm talking about the advisors who actually run the Labour Party, as revealed by the recent book Get In, the inside story of Labour under Starmer. These advisors brief that Keir Starmer thinks he's driving the train, but in fact they've sat him in front of the driverless District Light Railway. Now, originally these ghouls were going to impose a blanket real terms cut to personal independence payment by freezing it. Now, this PIP, personal independence payment, goes to people with disabilities on long-term health conditions, whether they're in work or not. And it helps them with the costs imposed, for example, by a lack of mobility. It can help pay for people to care for them, for example, or scooters to help them get around, or all manner of things. The clue is in the name. It's there to help secure independence for those who otherwise would be deprived of it. Indeed, it helps many of them work, for a start. As it is, even after receiving PIP, the average disabled household still faces extra costs of nearly £1,000 a month. Now, this has proven too much, this proposal, even for many of the androids who make up the Parliamentary Labour Party. Some of them began malfunctioning. You can tell, electric sparks start flying off the wires in the back of their necks. Ministers were threatening to resign, and some cabinet ministers have expressed their discontent. So it looks as though the government has been forced into a U-turn on freezing PIP, personal independence payments. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that does not mean their sadism has come to an end. Far from it. What they're instead planning on doing is raising the qualifying threshold for support, which will leave 620,000 people with disabilities and serious long-term health conditions losing on average £675 a month. According to the think tank, the Resolution Foundation, 70% of those cuts will fall on the back of families in the poorest half of society. Now, it's also reported that the government is planning on cutting the top rate of benefits for disabled people who are unable to work, which includes the most vulnerable, most severely disabled people that you can think of. It's worth just considering what reducing the number of people eligible for PIP will mean in practice. As it is, huge numbers of people with serious illnesses and conditions are being refused PIP, like 40% of people with multiple sclerosis and cerebral palsy, and around a quarter of amputees, for example. Now, a broadcast journalist who has actually shown both empathy as well as understanding about the actual details is Susanna Reid, presenter on ITV's Good Morning Britain. She was on BBC journalist Laura Kuenssberg's show this weekend.
You know, we had a charity talking to us on the programme this week, which say if you have a disability, it can cost an extra £1,000 a month simply to live your life. And so the anxiety that has been triggered by all of those sources and briefings has been enormous. People with terminal cancer wondering if their PIP payment's going to be frozen or cut. You know, people with cerebral palsy, people with bipolar, people with chronic mental health conditions. And I think the government, a Labour government, he pointed out it's a Labour government, should come out and say, these are the people who do not need to worry.
Well, as she says, this is a Labour government, and it is imposing policies which will drive its most vulnerable citizens into poverty. Indeed, this will drive yet more children into poverty. And that isn't just cruel, by the way, it's social vandalism all of us pay for, because children who grow up in poverty are less likely to fulfil their potential, and the whole of society then pays for that lost potential for generations. Now, Wes Streeting, the uber right-wing health secretary, who was very nearly defeated by the 23-year-old British Palestinian prodigy Liam Mohammed, just a few hundred votes, hideously close, next time though, says there is an overdiagnosis of mental health conditions. What is this guy's medical training? He did a history degree, and no offence intended to history graduates, I am one myself, but this is not exactly specialism, is it? For a start, he suggested that people are self-diagnosing, which is completely irrelevant because PIP is awarded after an independent medical assessment. Whether you've self-diagnosed or not is completely irrelevant. Let's talk a little bit more about Wes Streeting, shall we? The brilliant Faiza Shaheen, an economist who Labour blocks from standing as an MP at the last election because she's got actual principles, was on Question Time last week and brought up some home truths.
This is really important. This puts it in the hands of Wes Streeting. Now, the Good Law Project did some work around where funding is coming from, where donations are coming from. And 60% of his donations since 2015 have come from either companies or individuals linked to private healthcare. What we're seeing right now in terms of waiting lists is a two-track system. So if you've got a simple thing to do, it's going to the private sector. We as taxpayers are paying the private sector. Okay, good, because the waiting lists are going down a bit quicker. If you've got something more complicated, it's staying in the NHS, which is more difficult.
But are you saying by mentioning the funding, that Wes Streeting has, I don't know if that's right or not, are you saying that he's basically being bought by private interests that's affecting his decision?
Listen, what
Otherwise,
I'm saying
is that not the implication of what you're saying?
That is the implication of that work the Good Law Project has done. What I'm saying is that we have to be careful when we put this directly in the hands of politicians. We should look at where they get their donations from. Of course we should. We should look at why it is that our private sector contracts in the NHS are now being made for longer periods of time. And we should worry about this because in the short term, you might think, okay, their waiting list going down. In the longer term, as we've learned in Thames Water, as we've learned in different privatisation like trains, it ends up costing us more. So this is my general concern about this, is that we need to make sure we still have accountability.
Well, that has to be a concern because this so-called Labour government is indeed speeding up privatisation of our National Health Service. And here's another point. Is overdiagnosis really the problem here? Let's listen to the ever-wise John McDonnell, who was kicked out of the Parliamentary Labour Party for the really awful, hideous crime. Wait for this. It really is awful. He voted against Tory benefit cuts, which drive children into poverty.
So the number of working age people with mental and behavioural conditions as the primary reason for their welfare claim has risen from 1.9 million 10 years ago to 3.3 million today. That is a huge increase, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I tell you why. For a number of years, I've been arguing that the cuts under the austerity measures of the last government withdrew lots of services, particularly to young people and particularly support for families. So what we have now is a build-up of all the problems caused by that are hitting us. So what we've got to do is look at a strategy over the next few years in which we can restore the support that those people had. And I have to, I'm not getting political about this, but I have to say a number of us were saying to the last government, when you cut the support, particularly to young people and families, you eventually, what will happen is there will be a build-up of problems that will hit us. So I just think we're inheriting real problems as a result of poor judgment of the last government.
It gets worse. Even Ed Balls, the former Labour Shadow Chancellor, who committed to austerity light and then humiliatingly lost his seat, says cutting the benefits of the most vulnerable in our society who can't work to pay for that is not going to work, and it's not a Labour thing to do. It's not what they're there for. And that's the key point. What is the point of a Labour government which drives the most vulnerable people further into misery? Indeed, the former Tory Chancellor, George Osborne, was forced into a humiliating retreat back in 2016 when he tried to attack disability benefits and found himself criticised over that by even Boris Johnson. What is genuinely disgraceful is that the government is pushing myths and deceit to justify attacking desperately vulnerable people. They claim that the number of people considered too sick to work had increased by 383% since the pandemic. As the Joseph Rowntree Foundation notes, it's more like 40%. And as the New Economic Foundation's Tom Pollard also notes, the government has falsely claimed a person is placed in binary categories of either fit to work or not fit to work, erasing a middle group of claimants receiving less support, less financial support, who are obliged to seek employment support. He also notes they're promoting myths that those who receive help are there permanently, with many hoping in practice to actually resume work. This is all feeding the idea of the idle, lazy scrounger living it up at the expense of the taxpayer. Now, a crucial point here is Labour isn't starting from the point of how can we help disabled people. That's what they're claiming, but it's just not true. What they're really starting from is the point of how can we cut spending? As it is, the Financial Times revealed that Britain's social security net is amongst the weakest in the Western world, with our poorest citizens worse off than even their equivalents in Slovenia. So actually in Europe. And it's a Labour government set to make that even weaker. So rather than increase taxes on those who already have too much money, Labour are going to hit the poorest in society. Dan Abbott, who Keir Starmer also tried to purge, is amongst those arguing for a wealth tax. A few years ago, a wealth tax commission set up by leading academics and tax experts found a one-off tax on multimillionaire couples paid at 1% for 5 years would raise £260 billion. But do we really expect a Labour government whose leading figures get showered with freebies is going to get the booming rich to contribute more? But you see, unless we get the rich to pay more, and after all, their wealth is created by the effort of millions of people working every day. It's not the CEOs sitting around and their magic makes the money appear. It's the work of people using their hands and their brains, or both. You know, and it's if we don't tax that properly, we're going to be faced with endless decline, endlessly told by governments, we've got to cut and cut and cut. And indeed, they've also imposed these arbitrary fiscal rules they've taken from the Conservatives, which are completely unnecessary. They're a straitjacket, which it means in practice trying to balance the books based on arbitrary targets on the backs of disabled people, pensioners, and children. Which is why, by the way, this point from the commentator Taj Ali is so important to make.
So at some point, you've got to ask, what does the Labour Party stand for? Ian Duncan Smith's telling you he wouldn't go there. You're picking the pockets of our pensioners. You're set to preside of the highest rates of child poverty since 1998. I mean, Labour was the party that set up the welfare state, that tried to support the poorest and most vulnerable in society. If you want to raise revenue, let's talk about taxing the super rich. Let's look at wealth taxes. Why is it always the poorest and most disadvantaged in society that are having to pick up, the costs?
Look, this government's already despised by most of the country, and rightly so. And I'm going to say it, but some of us did predict this would happen. I was widely ridiculed. Look, I'm not bitter, just stating a fact. But I did say over and over again that this government would be this total nightmare. As I wrote over 4 years ago, there was an increasingly obvious truth. The party's leadership lacks a political soul and is devoid of any meaningful, coherent vision for the country it seeks to lead. Was I right? Was I wrong? And as my brilliant colleague at The Guardian, Nesreen Malik, says in a really important piece today in The Guardian, the idea this government would prove more left-wing, more radical in office, which was the claims we were told that he's playing three-dimensional chess, Keir Starmer, that's all been, I think, pretty devastatingly discredited. We need to build something different. We need an alternative to this. Because otherwise we're just faced with decline, stagnation, growing misery in a rich country. That means, for example, the Green Party working with other candidates or another left-wing party to build an alliance which argues for taxing the well-off, to invest in our people and services, bringing our utilities under the ownership of the British people, taking on the climate emergency, creating jobs in the process, the jobs of the future, to replace many of the secure jobs which were ripped out of entire communities. Maybe, stop slaughtering people abroad, that kind of thing. We could go on. This government is sinking because it is soulless. It is devoid of vision. And it's run by genuinely very unpleasant hacks who are going to end up working for private health companies and management consultancies. If we don't get our act together, then it's Nigel Farage who's going to win by default. No pressure, guys. Please like and subscribe with your thoughts and your comments. Help us take on the dire mainstream media, which has helped, I would note, demonize benefit claimants in order to help attacks like this on disabled people and vulnerable people. You can help us at patreon.com/OwenJones84. Listen to us on the podcast as well. That is now properly up and running, so you don't have to, I keep saying it, but just, look at my face. Look forward to speaking to you in a bit.